I mean, it's more complex than that, but golly, man, as a starter, take your congregation and get out there. Who's to say we have to preach a sermon every Sunday? What if we allowed the neighborhood to preach the sermon just by going out and being present? Like, what if you walked out the doors of your congregation just once, one Sunday? You got 51 others where you just walked out the door and just went with your congregation. Why would that be such a big deal? Like, well, why would that ruin everything? We make this stuff up. We make up these systems and structures.
Austin, thank you for coming on the show, man. I'm so excited to have you on because we just got done doing a 6-part podcast series for Community One on here. And one thing I think that was so interesting about it was I didn't know really what Community One was when y'all came in here, but it kind of inspired me in a way that you and Hannah and your team, it's not as much just, we're trying to tackle all of these things on our own, but it's that we're actually coaching and mentoring a bunch of different nonprofits and groups throughout that city. Yeah. Was that the original goal of Community One, or is that how it kind of just slowly morphed into to get more done?
No, it slowly and then quickly morphed into that. So the original vision of Community One was just to see the people of God join in restorative works with God's mission in the city. So it was really just an online volunteer platform. That was the original version. And I was actually on staff at a local church, but the founder, Eric Cummings, he had that vision, and we shared a heart in that. Now, how it was expressed was different, but that was the original vision. And then we started doing the neighborhood work in TP Park when I joined the staff in 2017. And that work was so intensive that when we got asked to do a second neighborhood, we were like, no way. we simply cannot do that sort of deep dive, intensive work in multiple communities. And so we took on the mindset, kind of stumbled into it, honestly, of really Jesus' ministry and his plan for God's mission in the world of multiplying disciples. So we adopt a coaching model where we kind of huddle up with our friends and practitioners, but then they go and do the work on the ground in neighborhoods where they are, which I think is really just truly built off the ministry of Jesus and how he did kingdom work.
And before you did all of that, I think what a lot of people in the city would know you for, if they didn't know you before Community One, is that you were on staff at One Life. Yeah. And we've had Brett on the show before to talk about stuff. I saw the
episode. It was fun watching my good buddy and leader and pastor talk with you. That was good.
But before that, you were actually connected to a series of house churches that eventually came into One Life. Do I have that right?
Yes. Well, a series of house churches. So I like to joke and say that we were so successful at launching house churches that we grew our network of 2 down to 1 very rapidly. So that was the vision. Yeah. So the vision was to plant many house churches that would multiply in our region. We started with 2, shrunk back down to 1, and then we had launched our second and was getting ready to launch our third when we joined with One Life. So it was we only did the house church network for about 2 years. So it was a short run.
So what was the reason that it kept shrinking back down?
Well, just learning and leadership. So I had graduated from seminary with an MDiv, but I didn't even know, I had never led anything. I hadn't even led a small group. I hadn't led a church. I hadn't led a ministry. I had not led anything. In fact, during seminary, I worked at the City of Lincoln zoning office as assistant to the zoning director. So I did not have a lot of experience in ministry leadership. And so it was really just we didn't lose any people. It's just, we did a core group training with a core group of leaders, and then we immediately split into 2 house churches. And I just realized from a practical leadership standpoint that was too fast, that we really wanted to spend more time bringing those people back together into one larger house church, just to establish the culture, establish the rhythms, and really just get our people to comfortable and understanding what a house church was and what multiplication is and how that might be done best. So it wasn't that we lost people or really shrank. It's just that it was a learning experience.
Yeah, and that's interesting to me, because how do you convince people to go to house churches? Because we have a hard enough time getting people when we have quote unquote real churches with buildings and pews and pastors that are getting paid not well, but enough, and we have live music. How are you convincing people to go attend a house church?
Yeah, well, I think it was a mixture of two things. So first was we spent about 12 weeks really casting vision. So we did an invitation. So we spent about 12 weeks really casting the vision for what a house church would look like and what it would feel like and what the experience and rhythms of that would be like. And so I think there's a really important leadership principle in there of really pulling together a core group of people that you really do a deep dive of understanding with. But there's this really interesting passage in Mark 3 where Jesus, it says that a crowd of disciples, and it's the word aklos, it's the Greek word for a large crowd, same word that's used for feeding the 5,000. So it wasn't like there was just a few disciples. It was a crowd of disciples that are pressing in on Jesus. And it says out of that crowd, he calls to them the 12, those whom he desired is the way the standard version says the translation. And I think that's an important principle, and one we applied to the lampstand, is that I just called out by name some of the people that I had done ministry with over the years, that were lifelong friends, that I had grown up in youth ministry with, and I called out those just whom I desired to be with. Some of them were my family. And so there was about 30 adults that went through that 12-week kind of formation experience. And that went a long way in talking them into it. Was I just desired to be with them, and I knew they desired to be with me.
I always get interested too. What kind of people were the ones that you were bringing in? Because I always think, is it the people who became very dissatisfied with church culture, getting lost in the shuffle, large churches, or was it people who had come from traditional backgrounds but wanted something new and exciting, or was it just people that had no church background whatsoever?
I would say it was a mix of all that. I would say the common thread of all of them was truly just people that I knew loved Jesus and loved me, and I loved Jesus and loved them, and I thought, hey, let's just go on this journey together towards the cross, towards the mission of God, and see what happens. But I would say it was a mix. There was some people that were disenchanted with church, but that was not the motivation of inviting them. And there was one couple specifically that were not following Jesus at all. They were just friends of mine, and I was like, hey, let's see how they respond to this. And they said yes and joined with us. So I think it was a mix. Yeah.
I think it would be pretty shocking for people to think of, I went from leading a house church to now I merged to what became one of the fastest growing churches in the country and one of the fastest growing churches in the world.
It was a rocket ride, man. So that thing was just wild. Everything from the group's experience that I had leadership with, to the Sunday morning attendance, to our work in neighborhoods, like it didn't matter what it was. Those first really the first 7, the whole time I was there, but definitely the first 4 or 5 years was a true rocket ride. It was just this explosive growth and multiplication. And for an example, I oversaw our groups ministries. When I joined staff there to oversee the groups ministries, I think there was 18 groups, and just in a year and a half, we had multiplied to 72 groups with over 800 people in our small groups ministries just on the rosters. When you think about that, was just the groups, the people who are on rosters in groups, and that was just and that's just one example. It just was really explosive growth. So it was very different going from a house church network of 30 adults and maybe 50 people total, including kids, to overseeing a groups ministry alone that had 72 groups and over 800 people in them. That's wild.
That's more groups than people.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, exactly. I didn't even think about that. Yeah. So it was quite a ride, and something that I was ill-equipped and very young in my leadership to do, but
in a way, it kind of makes sense. I always quote this book to people, but there's a famous book called One Size Doesn't Fit All, where it talks about church growth. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I love in it, I try to explain this to people who are maybe anti-mega church or anti-big church.
Sure.
One of the things that the author talks about is that actually what a mega church is, it's actually a series of small churches, a collection of small churches that are meeting at one place on Sunday.
Yeah.
But what you don't see is, for that church to actually be effective, is they're actually a bunch of small Sunday schools and small groups, or what you may call house churches, that are actually meeting together, doing life, having community, and they're just meeting up for a Sunday service. So in a way, what you were doing before was actually really great preparation for starting a system like that.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, almost all of those 30 adults that had participated in our house church network, almost all of them became group leaders at One Life. And so that was
going to be my next question, actually, because I think of people who go to a house church sometimes as like being anti big church. We go to a house church because we don't want to be there. So what was it, the response like of, hey, we're going to go actually merge with this new thing that's starting, that's probably going to be bigger?
Yeah. So we weren't at Lampstand, we weren't traditional Sunday centric, I call them Sunday centric churches, or Sunday morning service churches. We were anti that. I can't remember the name of the book that you referenced, but I had read a book called Viral Churches by Ed Stetzer. And he talked about how at Walmart, you go to Walmart and there's 20 lanes, but only one is open, or two are open. And he was really calling for different expressions of churches to be launched in the world, really calling back to the early church that was viral, that spread and overtook the ancient world. They didn't meet on Sunday morning, or not in the traditional service sense anyways. So that was the idea. We just wanted to open up more lanes for people to experience Jesus, to experience Christian community. And so we weren't anti. And so when we got connected with One Life, it was really an answer of two things. One is that kind of not having to worry about the what I would call as the gathering. So the Greek word for church is just the ekklesia, which is the assembly or the calling out and the collection of the people of God into one space. And so if someone's against that, then I feel like they don't have a very robust understanding of what church is. So whether you're assembling as 30 people or 10 or 15 or 5,000, I think we need to retain that idea of gathering and assembling of the churches. So we weren't anti. So the other thing that we were really facing at Lampstand, like I said, is that I was young in my leadership. And so we were actively praying for eldership, for elders. So our original model or understanding of churches is that we, as the house churches were going to multiply, the leaders of the house churches were going to be the oversight. They were going to be the elders. But we were 2 years in and we only had 2 house churches. And so we needed some oversight leadership. And so really One Life also afforded us the capability of having immediate oversight leadership and eldership, which was such an answered prayer for us.
Yeah. Before I go into that even more, I just think it's interesting. A lot of times when I hear people talk about house churches, it comes from one of two places. One, just very upset with what I'll say is the traditional, what we think is the traditional church model. We meet on Sundays. We have these amount of programs. We structure this way. And then the other side of it is, we're a church plant and we're hoping to explode one day. Those are one of the two. But you're talking about something that's very, very different, differently focused, where you're not really anti-traditional model, but you're also not trying to be like a parachurch almost said military.
That's a different conversation altogether.
but a parachurch organization, you're something completely different.
Yeah.
But I guess with that, why merge then?
Yeah. Okay, so man, it's hard to go back and think of all the different variables that went into that. So we were fledgling. It was nice to connect to someone who had established leadership, who had experienced systems. But really, I think it was two main things. Okay, so one is, we encouraged our people that were in the house church network to go wherever they wanted to on Sunday mornings. So like if they wanted to go to the Baptist church, or they want to go to the Catholic church, or they wanted to go to One Life, that was fine. We encouraged them to go wherever. And in fact, that was how I got connected to One Life, is that my family had started attending semi-regularly at a church plant with my friend Trey McLean, who had planted Discovery Church. And so we started going there semi-regularly, and he had gotten connected to One Life. And so that's how relationally I got connected. But it was actually this idea of, man, what if we didn't have to worry about Sunday morning services? Because I'm not against the Sunday more traditional church, but I do want to recognize there are some challenges with Sunday service. I call it the Sunday service as the black hole of need. It just needs so much attention. It needs so much of the staff's resources of time and energy and financial investment. And so we were like, man, what if we could gather Christians in community where they get all the benefits of what happens when you gather in like a missional community of Christians to go do the mission of God in the world, while also having this Sunday service that happens that's excellent, that has good preaching, that has good youth ministry, that has good systems and services, but we don't have to actually participate in building it. And so that was some of the motivation of joining with One Life is, man, they already had all this amazing stuff going on. What if we took this missional community idea and wed it or joined it with a missional kind of approach to Sunday mornings where people felt comfortable bringing their unchurched, secular-minded friends.
So you went to One Life then?
Well, I started at Discovery Church, but then Trey was and that became like Lampstand and Discovery joined both two church plants.
Okay.
One that was more traditional Sunday-based services, and one house church network. We really came together to be some of the core that launched One Life West.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
All right, and then
interesting, isn't it? Wild, all this history.
The amount of pastors I have from Evansville, it is a
all these connections.
They all interconnect in some way, and we and Chad have a running joke. It all goes back to One Life.
Well, in some ways, or you could even say back to Bethel, right? Because Brett, as he said on here, launched out of Bethel in the Edge service, and so there's all these connections, and I like to, if we could somehow erase all these, worldly names and corporations and 501b3s or whatever churches are like, and just saw us as kingdom teams, like, man, you would see a lot of these beautiful connections that I've seen over the years.
Yeah, and it gets hard. I think a lot of it almost sometimes comes from I'll say a big word, the tribalism of the congregation sometimes, even though us as pastors can be the worst. I've always said if I was asked about it, the worst problem I see that builds up in ministers right now is jealousy. Is jealousy of looking at others and seeing what they have and what you don't have. And that's always, it kills the joy of ministry.
Comparison is the root of many evils.
I love how Craig Rochelle puts it. Comparison is the thief of joy. Ooh. And I think he stole that from someone else.
Probably, but it's good. He made it viral, didn't he?
Yeah, he did.
That's his unique gift.
But one thing I hate is the conversation sometimes, and I've been asked this. I was asked this once when I was being interviewed for a church. A guy who had been going to that church for a long time asked me, "How do you plan on competing with all these larger churches around us?" And I had to break the news to him. I don't plan. I don't plan to.
Yeah, and that was our mindset. With Lampstand, we didn't want to compete with all these churches. Like at the time, this is way back in 2010 when we were preparing. Like One Life launched 10-10-10, so Crossroads was around, and Bethel. We didn't have any. We didn't want to compete with any of those. We wanted to fill out. We wanted to open new aisles for people to experience Jesus, and we thought I'd been impacted by a guy named Mike Breen and a book called Mission of God by Christopher Wright, and really just the early history of the local church. Like one of the things that we know is that the viral nature of the early church was because there was a network of house churches, decentralized house churches, people owning their faith, living it out, creating impact in the flow of their everyday life. Like that's what we wanted to really experience and have others experience.
Yeah. Would you say that you think one of the biggest dangers for the local church is that we become too Sunday service focused, that we forget to do ministry the rest of the week?
I would say that one of the biggest dangers that and it kind of builds on what you said, is that we leave the missional frontier.
What's the missional frontier?
Yeah, so that's, again, instead of influence, I'll try to be quick on this, but I was heavily influenced at the end of my first round of seminary by a book called Mission of God by Christopher Wright. And he argues for a missional hermeneutic, like God sends his breath to order creation. He sends his people into the world to be a blessing to the nations. He sends his son to redeem it and reconcile it to himself. And then he sends his church to bear testimony and witness to the gospel. And eventually he'll send heaven to earth to redeem all things. And so this idea of a missional hermeneutic, so when I say the missional frontier, it's the place where the presence of God through sin, through human agency, through all the complexities of the world, where the kingdom of God is not present. And so he talks about a God of mission forming a people of mission in the arena of mission. And so where that arena of mission is, where we need to be as the light of Christ in the world, is where the darkness reigns, where the fruits of the Spirit are not. That's where we need to be. And that's where pastors need to be. That's where church leaders need to be. That's where the people of God, just as everyday missionaries, need to be. We need to be where darkness reigns, where the fruits of the spirits are not, so that people can experience them. And so it's very easy for people who are leading organizational churches to withdraw, whether that's into their office or into their church building or into their Sunday services, and not be present where the gospel is. Jesus never left the missional frontier. He was always where the kingdom needed to be. And so I think we lose something when we disconnect ourselves from the missional frontier. And if we only ever spend time doing ministry and preaching and all these things in the church building, in the church services, then yes, I think that becomes a danger, because then all of our kingdom resources, our structures, our systems, our communication, they become insulated and isolated from the very purpose of why we need to exist in the first place.
I want to get very practical with this, because I want to learn more to see what this would look like for pastors. So this is going to be very localized, so I'm going to try to explain it for the audience a bit better. Imagine, I'm thinking about if there was a church that existed on what we call the north side of Evansville.
Okay.
For people on the outside, the north side of Evansville formerly was known as kind of a more rural community, is now starting to see a lot of growth. Mm-hmm. Its high school there is the biggest high school. Imagine, it's overfilled. They're having to turn kids away. Yeah. It's very fast growing. It's very near a lot of jobs on the outside, a lot of factories and other work like that that's throughout the region. So formerly rural, now a very fast growing region. A lot of young families that I know personally who are moving there, as well as older families who afforded the houses that were out there. If a church was out there and they were saying, they came to you and they said, we want to be missionally focused. Mm-hmm. What would that mission look like for them, apart from just what a normal church would look like with Sunday service and Sunday school? Yeah,
man. Well, I would go through a process with them of just listening, discovering who God's called into that congregation, what they're passionate about, why they exist in the first place. So I wouldn't be able to answer that question for them. But if they want to have a geographical focus on the north side, then it would be just simply being present where they are geographically located. So you may have, like a friend of mine, actually Trey, I mentioned him earlier, he talked about the mission of God is manifesting in people or place or purpose or place. And so the work that we do in the neighborhood revitalization work that we do in the name of Jesus, that's very place-based. And so if I was going to help a local congregation get engaged in place-based ministry on the west side or on the north side, then we would look for a neighborhood or look for a geographical focus, or we would look for a place to root and belong and start building relationships with. But that would look very different than, say, if you were youth, if the primary expression of your missional engagement in the city wanted to be revolved around youth, well, then that would look very different. Or maybe it was foster care or something like that. That's what I mean by more of like a purpose.
Gotcha.
So purpose or place, I would want to find out what was that congregation, what they were called to, and what they were uniquely bent towards to see what that means. So that is one of the things that I think is important to note about the mission of God, is oftentimes when we think about God's missional purposes in the world, we think about the poor and the needy, or we think about the disenfranchised and marginalized. And while that's very much a part, and I believe that God has shown a special concern for those populations, it's really any place, just for clarity, any place where God's kingdom is being, where God is bringing his kingdom to bear in the lives of everyday people where it's not, so that can look like just about anywhere, including the soccer field in an affluent neighborhood.
Yeah. Well, let me ask this: what does it look like when a church is not a part of their community? They're not active in the neighborhood where they were originally planted, or they planted themselves. What does that look like to you? Well,
I think it really becomes a shriveling, is what it looks like to me. If you think about a beautiful planted garden or vineyard, it's like you plant these seeds and they flourish and grow and they're ripe and they're creating lushness, and that's, I believe, God plants a church to be that kind of seed, to see the garden grow, to see the transformation come to the world through the local church body. But if you don't continue to be growing and fruitful and outwardly focused and divesting of your, then all of a sudden everything starts becoming more about you and your need and what you need to accomplish. And can I get people to and so by the end of that, it's just a shriveling up into nothingness. You become completely irrelevant. And I can give one quick story from the neighborhood work we do. There's a church in our neighborhood. I'm not going to name the church, but they are antagonistic to the neighborhood work that we're doing. They really don't want to engage. They the congregation drives into the church on Sunday morning, and then they drive out. And it's just wild that neighbors have now recognized, one of you even called them the devil as we were introducing them, because they've had such an antagonistic relationship with the church themselves, where they've kind of demonized them as neighbors. So that's just what I can see. That's what I mean is, like, if you get into the point where you are calling people that you should be doing ministry with and for the devil or demon, then you've probably missed something in your church missional engagement in the city.
Well, and let's get even more specific into that, because I think that's where it gets down to, like, okay, this is what went wrong. Like Rayner would have said, this is an autopsy of a deceased church.
Yeah.
What I like to sometimes, my wish is that most churches won't die, but they'll be able to figure out the problems before it gets to almost a point of no return and just brokenness in the relationship between the church and their neighbor. What are some of the symptoms that a church is no longer representative or in community with the neighborhood that it's in?
Well, again, I want to be clear that I think not every church has to be a place-based church. They can be purpose-driven, not place-driven. But the work that I'm more comfortable within is the place-based. So I'll answer that. So, like, for example, I've been part of a church plant on the south side called Open Table. And we are place-based. We try to do ministry and build relationships with people on the south side. And so a congregation ought to look like the community that it's ministering to. So for a real practical example, the south side in the neighborhood that I live in TP Park, it's 60%, 40% white minority, 60% minority, 40% white. If we're doing ministry well, if we're building relationships with people, if we're inviting people to our church services, if we're getting involved into the discipleship and everyday lives of people, then it ought to at least somewhat reflect that diversity. And so if you went to a open table church service that was 100% white, doing ministry on the south side of Evansville that's 60% black, then I would say chances are that's an early indication that you're becoming a little too insular in what you do and how you operate and how you communicate and talk, and the ministry activities that you're doing in the world. They're becoming a little too insular. So that's just an example.
Yeah. And my question is always, how do you change that? Because I always remember there was a church that my General Baptist movement was associated with, and it was in very much an inner city. And at the time, it was actually I won't name it, but it was in a inner city that had gone under a lot of racial, I'll just say conflict at the time. And it was pretty much at the peak of almost how bad that things got for a time in this country. But it was so interesting within that inner city, 100% of the church was white. 100% in an area that was overwhelmingly majority African American.
Yeah.
If you're and I've even pastored in a church in that exact scenario, and my church was like 99% white. Yeah. So how can something like that even be fixed if you're bothered by that?
Yeah, if you're bothered by that. So I would say the first one is to truly be present. Like get into the flow of where people are and start building relationships. Like that's number one. Like I just don't know of any other way to be missionally effective unless you're present on the mission. That's why I was talking about the missional frontier. So like it can start as simple as disrupting your life by getting out in the neighborhood and doing walks. Like just get out of your church building, get into the spaces and places where people are, and just be present with no ulterior motive to start, right? Like, so one of our congregations that we partner with in a Love Your Neighborhood initiative is Renew Church on the West Side in the Lamasco neighborhood. I love what they did as a congregation. They spent, I think it was like 6 months or maybe 3 months or 6 months, and they just put a map on the wall of their church and they encouraged their congregants to just go be present, not necessarily yet to go evangelize or to go do acts of service or just go be present, go listen, just go hang out in a park. What a great first step. And so, like, I think that's first, because if you're ever going to change the diversity in a congregation, you have to build genuine relationships with people, because if you don't have genuine relationships, why would they come to your church if they don't know you or know who you're about or what you're doing? Especially if you look different, act different, talk different, then that relational equity, as we call it, will not be there, and the trust won't be there.
What would you say if there was a pastor who was leading a congregation who was resistant to doing some things you were talking about? I don't necessarily mean antagonistic, even though that exists as well. But for instance, if there was a pastor who identified that, hey, we are not present in our community, whatever our community is, smaller or larger community, we're not present. But the church wanted them to be more focused on the congregation that existed instead of what the pastor saw as the congregation that was missing. What would you say to the pastor who was struggling with that end of it? Yeah,
and this is where I would be hesitant to put my own 2 cents on there. I would just say this, okay, just as an observation, all right? When I look through the Gospels, when I spend time at the feet of Jesus, as we see the testimony and power of the witness of Scripture, and I know there's contextual issues, okay? I just want to say up front, I understand context. I understand we're 2,000 years later. We're not a Jewish religious system.
He's a doctor, trust him.
I understand that, okay? But just trying to simplify it as much as possible. When I spend time at the feet of Jesus and learn from him as the ultimate disciple maker, he never left the missional frontier. He went to where people were. Story after story that we could talk about and reference in the Bible. The woman at the well, Zacchaeus in the tree, the leprous man in the desert. Like Jesus was where people were, and he had disciples with him. So if you're talking about you want to shape disciples of Jesus, well, the 12 were with Jesus when he was with the woman at the well. He was just with Jesus when he was with Zacchaeus in the tree. Oh, yeah. And by the way, around his table in his house. And he was with Jesus when he was in the desert with the lepers community. Like, so if you want to shape and form missional disciples, by all means, shape and form a missional congregation. Make that congregation look like disciples of Jesus. No, so if the leadership of the church congregation is resistant and saying a pastor ought to be shepherding and forming the congregants, then I say, yes, that is absolutely true. But the shepherd needs to go out to make sure the sheep are getting fed some grass out of the out into the field. Get them out into the field, and then the Holy Spirit will do that transformative work as they are being discipled by Jesus. So, I mean, it's more complex than that. But golly, man, as a starter, take your congregation and get out there. That would be fun. Even if it's just a walk. Who's to say we have to preach a sermon every Sunday? What if we allowed the neighborhood to preach the sermon just by going out and being present? Like, what if you walked out the doors of your congregation just one Sunday? You got 51 others where you just walked out the door and just went with your congregation. Why would that be such a big deal? Like, well, why would that ruin everything? We make this stuff up. We make up these systems and structures. We can take a Sunday off and walk out, so that's why I love our friend Dave Whitmore on the West Side. At least 4 times a year they do that on Sunday mornings. They walk out of their church building, and I think that's a cool thing. So anyways, I could rant and rave more about that, but I'm sure you want to move on.
No, that's absolutely perfect. Let's talk more on the missional side of things. I always wonder, so you've gotten to work with churches, you've been a pastor, you've worked on yourself. I think we all know when a church is not working on some kind of mission, there's only 3 ways that they are ending up, which is stagnant, dying, or dead. There's no church that's going to grow that is not in some way have some kind of mission that it's focused on. Is there ever a possibility that a church can suffer from focusing on the wrong mission?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I can say you can focus on the right mission and still suffer, because that's what happened at One Life. So we had built up that groups ministry. I'd said, 72 groups and 800 people. Like, that's an impressive thing. But I had become discontent with our groups ministry because I didn't want to see small groups just duplicate the same incompleteness. I won't say wrongness, incompleteness of the Sunday-centric church model. Like, just because Christians are gathering in living room doesn't mean they're participating in the mission of God. And so we didn't want our small groups to be holding tanks for Christian community. The light of Christ needs to be out in the world. So we went through this thing we called the shift. And so we were shifting our groups to be more missional with their mindset and their activities. Now, that was not meant to just be do more service activities. That's not what we meant by being missional, but that got kind of lost in the messaging. Anyways, one of the things that I noticed over time, that we noticed, was that people started becoming disenchanted with the activity that they thought that we were asking them to do. And again, we were not necessarily saying go do a bunch of service projects. That's not what we mean. Service and mission are not the same thing. They're related, they're interconnected, but they're not the same thing. And so what happened over time is, as we challenged our groups ministries to be more missionally minded and missionally focused, we noticed that our group's ministry started to shrivel and die. And
could you say part of it was they thought that they were being, quote unquote, over churched? You were just seeing how much you can get activity out of them.
Yeah. That was definitely some of it. Some of it was that we were planting churches very rapidly. So the timing of it, we needed to probably, there's a lot of leadership errors. We could get into those. There's some of them.
I'm not saying the error. I'm saying there's a lot.
It's okay. It's okay.
No, it's not what I meant.
It truly was. Like, there was error of leadership on my part. There was just, we were trying our best. But anyways, what I noticed, and what God, as I reflected on that time when we got on the other side of it, one of the things that was very clear was, why would people be on mission with Jesus if they're not spending time with Jesus.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I would do more than anything is I would go back and I would cultivate people's opportunity and understanding of what it means simply to fall in love with Jesus, to simply as the Apostle John did, to rest on his bosom, like to rest, to recline at the table with Jesus, to desire to be with him first, just be with him. That was the challenge of Mark 3, is Jesus called those whom he desired to be with him. Then he sent them out to preach and teach and cast out demons. So I would have really cultivated that formative experience, that formation within our congregation. So yeah, I think you can be focused on the mission of God to the detriment of the formation of the likeness of Christ. I think it happens all the time. People get overworked and they get burnt out and all that because they're not doing that.
Yeah. And do you think that's kind of an unfortunate side effect of what we would call the traditional church system, is sometimes we want to get it all in on Sunday so that we can focus on our personal life the rest of the week. And that's sometimes where our system falls short.
Well, I won't say that, but I'll say that you did. So no, I'm just kidding.
Well, it's something I've seen, and the honest thing of it, I don't think it's never been something that's really done on purpose, and it's surely not something pastors want to do.
No.
Because
99%
of our evangelism, that when it comes to making new disciples, comes from having Christians go out the other 6 days of the week. A church is not effective if it only has, if its members are only Christians between 9 and 11 on Sunday morning.
Yeah. And gosh, that's so good. So yeah, that's just a good reflection point. So I do want to make a note. Like I mentioned that church in the neighborhood, that is in my experience and opinion, that is the rarest of experiences. Most of the people, one of the benefits that I had at One Life was that I didn't have to worry about Sunday morning services. Brett and the team did that, most of that. And so like I had the opportunity to build relationships with other pastors, church collaborations. We did things like City Serve, where we called the Church of Evansville to serve. We do neighborhood work where multiple churches come together. And so what's really beautiful about that is that I've gotten to build relationship with so many church leaders. And like you said, none of them want to be inwardly focused. All of them want to make disciples. All of them want to be missional. They want the gospel to be proclaimed. They want kingdom work to get done. And they're doing the best they can within a incomplete system. And so, I mean, I couldn't agree more. Most of them are just simply overworked, underpaid, stretched thin. But I do think they have the opportunity to kind of slowly and responsibly transform the systems that they've helped create.
Yeah.
And the time is now.
One thing, through doing the show, I've made a lot more Pentecostal friends over the last year.
That's good.
A lot more. And but one thing I've loved that I've learned from them, this comes from me having more of a Baptist background. When someone wants to do a ministry, there's almost always a series of needing to ask for permission, right? And one of the things that I've seen out of that, when I now look at my Pentecostal friends, they don't really feel the need to ask anybody's permission. They see something, a spot that needs to be filled by Jesus and the Holy Spirit and his people, and they're going to go out and do it. And it made me want to think about one of your books that you'd show me. It's the fourth one from the bottom, actually. You hold that up. From couch to community. Yeah. What does it look like then for someone to be on their couch, to be on the pew of their church, and to say, I know God is calling me to do more, and he's putting something right in front of me that needs to be solved? What does it look like for that person to be effective in their next steps? Yeah, my very next step would be to make sure that you're living in Christian community, whatever that means to you. That can look like a traditional Sunday morning church. That can look like a small group, Sunday school, missional community. But
in America, we hold on to individualism and autonomy, which are good things. Like recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of individuals is important, and that's an innovation that Christianity brought to the world. Same thing with autonomy. Like we are human agents and can act in the world. Like that's something that atheism and determinism would not even affirm, right? So like there's something there that we need to retain individualism and autonomy. However, we've swung too far over here. So if you want to be a more effective missionary, everyday disciple, missionary in the world, make sure you're surrounded by Christian community, because you can't do it all. You can't be all things to all people. You can't fill yourself up with love and care and shepherding. So just make sure you're surrounded by people. But in the next thing with more effectiveness, I know this is kind of like 101 and maybe an eye roll moment, but you have to spend time at the feet of Jesus. You need to allow the life of Jesus, as you see in the Gospels, as he went and did ministry and mission, you need to let that inform and transform the way that you go about making disciples in the world. Because imagine this, the author of life became incarnate, moved into the neighborhood, as one of the Message translations says, and dwelt among the people, tabernacled with the people, was with people. We ought to pay attention to what we see in that testimony of how God himself lived out the incarnational life. And if we align our missional activities more and more with what we see and how Jesus shapes us, then we ought to experience more life, more joy, more fun experiences, more Holy Spirit moments where the power of God comes to bear if we're aligning our life with more Jesus. So to be more effective, those are the first two things I would do. Yeah. Live in Christian community and spend time with Jesus.
And so if someone had all of that, what would you say is more hurtful for that individual? Always staying on the couch thinking about what I should have done or what I could have done? Or is it when they went and they tried to do something and they just got put right back down on it?
Well, I think it's more hurtful overall to be a consumer that doesn't live out your faith. If you have some negative experiences or some misses and fails in ministry, then that might be painful, but God's going to use those for your good and his glory. And so I would say, like, you got to get out there and experience it. Like, think about Peter. Boy, he had some rough experiences as he was following Jesus when he was in his late teens, early 20s. But look what God ended up doing in the formative experiences that he did to help transform and launch the gospel, or not transform the gospel, launch the gospel and transform the ancient world through his leadership and testimony and presence. So I would say get out there, take some lumps, but make sure you're surrounded by other Christians that can help you out.
What would you say to someone who they're trying to do something and they keep running into a roadblock that they feel like they just can't get around? Whether it's something they're doing something as quote unquote small as having a small group, leading a class at church, all the way up to I'm going to start a nonprofit, or I'm going to take on a big community initiative, but they run into that roadblock. Yeah. What is something that you would say to that person that can either keep them going or maybe help them just refocus on what they need to do?
Yeah, this might be a little controversial, but I would say, again, do as Jesus did, in that Jesus, he didn't forsake the religious institutions that he was a part of. Like it says, the text says that he went to the synagogue as was his custom, right? Like we know he went to the temple when he was 12, like he went to the annual pilgrimage. So he was observant. He actually spends, one of the main characters in the Gospels is the scribes, Pharisees, and Sadducees. The religious leaders are a major player, right? And they were the ones leading the inset religious institutions. So Jesus didn't forsake those, but when he wanted to have mission effectiveness, what did he do? He called out the 12. He called out those whom he desired. So if you're out there and you're wanting to have mission effectiveness and you keep running into roadblocks and hurdles and systems that are failing you and leaders that are pushing back on you, I would say do as Jesus did. Call some people in the name of Jesus to your thing that you desire to be with. You notice Jesus didn't call any of the scribes, Sadducees, and lawyers to be part of the 12. He clearly didn't desire to be with them. And so within this, like, if you want to see missional movement, you got to call the 12. You got to get those around you whom you desire and get outside these systems that can't be effective. Get outside of it. Start something new. Get where people are. Again, think about in the synagogue, I bet they weren't experiencing a lot of transformation. But you know where they were? Where the healing was happening, where people were out on the missional frontier, where people are. So that would be my encouragement. It's just a lot more fun. We get stuck into these systems and these processes, and they become boring, and they become rote, and they become mundane. Man, you get back out where people are needed, where people need you, where they need the light of Christ. Man, it starts getting more energizing and exciting again.
Is that what keeps most people on the couch? Just the routine that they're stuck in?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, it's Francis Chan has a great line in The Forgotten God. He says, why would you experience the comforter if you're always comfortable? Well, why are people comfortable? Because it's comforting. Like, it's really easy just to get into these rhythms of, man, I had an emotional good time. My cup was filled on Sunday morning. Now I'm just in my work week. I got to be a good father, and I got to minister to my family, and I got to do my job. And then I got to come back again on Sunday. And it just becomes very easy to get into streaming and to hang out on the couch and to get, and let me tell you, it is very important to be a missional father, to be a missional in your workplace where you work 40 to 60 hours a week. That's just as important as anything else. I'm not calling for more activity or more burden or more whatever. But if you're getting to the point where you're just comfortable and you're sitting on that couch and you're not doing anything different in the name of Jesus for the kingdom of God, then it can be very easy to get trapped into that, in your own rhythm and system that you create for yourself.
What does it look like for a leader, a pastor, whoever it is, to look to their congregation and say, okay, we need to activate now? You could stand up on the pulpit every day and talk about real things that are going on in your community that people are struggling with. Here in Evansville, for instance, they just announced the debt right now for our area for power bills is $4.3 million in outstanding.
It's only going to grow.
But so that's a real thing that people are dealing with. We've had a lot of sickness because of the crazy weather that we've had, and there's even a program that I found out recently I thought was incredible. But what they'll do is they work with churches raise donations, give it to this company, and they negotiate with creditors to actually set people free of their medical debt. So there was like a church that gave $100,000 and they cleared like $10 million in medical debt.
Has done that.
And so it's so incredible. But if a pastor was to bring this, I can see it just so clearly how it could happen. You bring these real issues and, people are like, yeah, that's bad. I wish someone would do something about that.
Oh man, I love that. That's a line I use all the time.
Yeah, but how can a leader effectively look to his congregation and build that 12, or as you say, get them off the couch and into the community? Yeah.
And again, I get real hesitant to talk about that in the sense of, like, I don't know these congregations. I don't know these pastors. I don't know their callings. So what I'll say is, as a general principle, I'll say that pastors are often very good at telling people what to do, whether it's because they've been trained in formal, or maybe it's their authority or leadership positions. And I know that every denomination has a different hierarchical structure. I would encourage pastors to listen to their congregation well. Man, one of my favorite books that I read through the seminary, it was On Appreciative Inquiry. And this guy was helping congregations leave a legacy, to die with a legacy, instead of just see their resources just continue to be wasted as they close down as a congregation. And he went into the congregation, and the first congregation he did, there was only 60 members left. And he sat down over the course of 6 months with every one of those congregants, and he asked them, hey, what brought you to this church in the first place? What ministry or experience, when do you feel energized? When was the last time you remember loving coming to church? When did you invite someone to church last, and why? So he's asking them what they appreciated about their church body. Well, that church not only didn't close down, they ended up relaunching some focused ministries based on what they appreciated about their church. What I think that the larger principle there is that the leader, the pastor, and this consultant were listening to the congregation. Imagine listening to a congregation, what their unique passions and skills are, what their vocations are, what they are interested in their everyday life, what they're missionally called to. If you can listen well to your congregation, then I bet you can build ministries and effective missional engagement around where people are already energized, where they're already active, instead of calling them to something extra. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I also think when you are listening well, one of our favorite experiences at Community One is we mentioned City Church. They partnered with us in a year to pilot an app. It was just called Acts of Love. So you can listen in innovative ways with technology now. So for a whole year, they encouraged their congregation. They just did a brief definition of what an act of love was, and then asked them to write down every act of love they did in the name of Jesus over the past year. Talk about listening to a congregation. We had over 2,800 acts of love documented that this congregation had did. So we know the missional engagement that congregation is already doing in the name of Jesus. Now imagine, instead of telling a congregation what they ought to do from the pulpit, now you build a ministry around what they're already doing and how they're already engaging. Wow. When I think about the potentials for that, I get really excited.
And you should. I asked you before, what are the symptoms of a church who's not involved in their community and a church that is not missional? What is the symptoms of a church who is missional and is passionate about their community?
Good question. Way to flip it. Well, I would say just kind of giving some, again, standard Christian answers. I think it is the fruits of the Spirit. So I think if you are on the missional frontier, allowing the ministry of Jesus, allowing the life and testimony of Jesus to shape and form the ministry that you're doing in the world, and you're relying on the Holy Spirit to empower and equip and send you, then you ought to experience more patience, more kindness, more gentleness, more self-control. These are certainly above all these love. And so if you can look at your congregation and see these things, if these are the apparent fruit that other people are tasting and seeing, then I think you're doing a good job joining with Jesus in his mission. If you're not, then I think you need to get out there, and I think you need to do some of these missional practices that will start to cultivate the seeds of the fruit. But the other one that I'll say is that I think people will start being excited to participate in your church. Now, I use that word purposefully, because I think when we think of success, we inherently think of more people numerically in church on a Sunday morning service. And that may happen. And I personally don't think there's anything wrong with that. As you said, sometimes there's an overreaction in the missional church to the mega church. I don't even care about any of all that. What I care about is people participating in the ministry. And so if your people are participating in the ministry, however you define that at a local church, that is the fruit of good pathways to missional engagement.
I kind of, as we wrap up, I actually wanted to save one of my hardest questions for you for last.
All right.
So, and this one is a bit personal to me, but I wanted to ask, and I'll give more background to this after the question.
Okay.
What should a church, or even just a group or a nonprofit, whoever it is, what should a organization do who's passionate about helping their community, but the community is antagonistic or harmful against them?
Yeah.
And I'll get personal about it.
Yeah, please.
The first church I ever pastored fully was a small church in the inner city of Louisville, Kentucky. The year I got there, they had 200 murders. The year after, they had 200 murders, which were both records.
Yeah.
The church had gates on the parking lot that we would lock with a padlock every day. And I had a gate, my driveway, people would actually, if the gate was left open, people would use my driveway as a cut through for the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And it actually led to a pastor getting clipped and hurt there one time.
Oh my gosh.
But the most antagonistic thing, I mean, was that, people would, I hate using this word, but loiter on the front of the church, and they would smoke weed and they would leave their stuff there. I kicked out a guy once who was literally doing a line off of
off of something.
No, off the stairway of the church.
Oh, wow.
He did a line.
Wow, bold.
One time we were the hose that we would use to empty out there was a thing above it to empty out the baptismal, and then below that, we could use that same water source to fill out stuff if we wanted. And a neighbor had attached a hose to that and was stealing our water to fill a pool. And even remember one time I was really annoyed about these gates, and one day I accidentally left them open, and the one day I left it open, someone left a stolen car in the parking lot.
Oh my.
So I'm telling you all this.
Yeah, a little context. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know the context is so important to you in these questions, but I mean that was my experience. And at the same time, it was so hard to reach a community that felt very distrusting of my church and me, because all they knew was people taking advantage of them, and I was just another pastor that wanted their money or their attention or whatever. Yeah. So what should an organization or a church do when they're in a community that's antagonistic against them? Yeah.
Well, here in America, we sometimes forget that we're supposed to, and I'm not saying this about you, I'm just saying, just generally speaking, sometimes we forget that Jesus was crucified on a cross, that we are to pick up our cross daily, that we are expected to face persecution. In fact, one of my, in Revelation in chapter 7, when it talks about the tribulation is the crushing pressure we experience between heaven and earth, the heavenly realities and the worldly realities. And as Christians, we're caught in the middle of that. It's the tribulation. It literally means crushing pressure. And so Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble. So I think we need to remind ourselves that we ought to experience some pushback when darkness doesn't like light. So when we bring the light of Christ. Now, having said that, I do believe in safe, not irresponsible unsafety. We can do ministry in challenging situations with safety. But again, I think Jesus modeled, by the very people that persecuted him, by the very people that ended up crucifying him, he spent time with them. It says he reclined at the table just like he did with his disciples, and just like he did with the marginalized. He did that with the religious leaders as well that ended up killing him. Jesus didn't draw lines, he erased them. And he did that through faithful presence, through good works. And so when I think about a local church body that may be in an antagonistic situation, that community is not going to be antagonistic if you're repairing the streets that they walk on. Yeah. If you're repairing lights that are broken in their community, if you are bringing gardens to dry places, if you are bringing restoration, the chances are very, very high that the surrounding community is going to receive you eventually. It may take longer than you're comfortable with. We're in year 8 in our TV Park Neighborhood Initiative, and we're not a local church, but we are a Christian parachurch or Christian organization. It took us about 3 to 5 years before we started gaining trust and equity, with relational equity with neighbors in the neighborhood. So I would say, take different timelines. Remember, we serve an eternal God, and what feels like really fast to us is a blip on the radar of infinity. So take these infinite games, if you will, that are God's timelines for kingdom, and just remember that over time, these repeated good works, these repeated relational equity, they will make a difference eventually. or, you might get persecuted and ran out of town.
Yeah. And I think back to the other, something that Jesus has once told his disciples when he sent them out 2 by 2 is if there's a community that rejects you, shake the dust off your feet and leave.
Right. And that's a thing. That's an unpopular teaching. Like there is you may not ultimately ever be received. You may do everything right by the book, from couch to community. Like you might do the formula exactly correctly. And guess what? It still may not make a bit of difference. The outcomes that we hope to see are not ultimately the outcomes that happen because of sin on one hand or God's providence on the other. Like God's kingdom outcomes are not going to look like our humanly outcomes that we expect to see, and sin and human agency disrupt the places where we hope to do ministry in, and they're not going to look like how we want. The cookie cutter way will not present the gingerbread man.
and to follow that up, as someone who kind of bridges the gap in this way, how should a church respond when they become opposed to a systematic roadblock? So something, not just like problem with the community, but there's a systematic governmental roadblocks in their way. I'll give 2 examples. One, this actually goes to the city of Evansville. I don't care, but they took a yard sign that I had in my house inviting people to church. It was taken away, and I come to find out it's actually, they have rules for it where they don't allow churches to put out signs that's not promoting a temporary event 48 hours before the event, but they make the exception for politicians and their signs. Okay. They can have it out the whole political season and then some. A larger one that I've seen was a coworker of mine's church when I lived in Louisville. Her church was a very well-known church. I think it was one of the oldest African-American congregations in the South. And the city of Louisville had said, hey, we're actually making this a historical building. So even though your congregation's exploding, you cannot make any changes to the building.
Wow.
So there was actually a real systematic roadblock that kept them from fulfilling their mission. And sometimes that happens to us as churches. We want to take on community projects, but we can't get the right permission. We can't get the right permits, or there's just certain limits to what we do. And maybe even there's some churches, they're in certain communities, they're not very pro-church for whatever the reason may be and outside of their control. What should a church do when it's hit up, when it kind of brushes up against those roadblocks created by governments or systems or whatever they may be?
Yeah, I would say a real easy practice that anyone can adopt today and be an expert at is the lean startup or Kaizen principle of the 5 whys. Just asking why 5 times. Like, why did you want to put that yard sign up in your yard? Seriously, why?
Yeah. No, I want because the church I was pastoring at the time was completely invisible, and I believed in the mission that we were doing, and the sermon I would fit into my sermon every Sunday is I believe that the gospel is transformational in every way, that transforms us on an individual level, in a family level, and out of that on a community level.
See, that's beautiful. So then the lean startup principle is you ask why 5 times, and eventually you get to the root of the problem instead of the expression of the problem. And so like it's applied to, like Toyota assembly line, like what is the actual root problem? Let's fix that instead of the symptom that's up here. And so like when you're trying to get around systems that are inset, that are almost impossible to change, you can ask why 5 times, and eventually you get down here to the deeper problem, and then you can express it however you want, right? So it doesn't matter. You can get around the systems as long as you're rooting in the why, and as long as you're rooting in the root cause of why you want to participate in whatever activity it is in the first place. And I guarantee you will still be able to do the why it'll just look different. And if you understand what the expression is versus the root cause, then it doesn't really matter what vehicle takes you there for that.
And I think it's so important too to realize that we're not to be at odds. And I know it becomes it's popular and it's cool to be at odds with government or whatever. But
well,
also,
it depends on what side of the aisle your politics are on, right? Like right now, it's really easy for the conservative crowd to get in line with the government. It's not so easy when the liberal side is in power, and vice versa. Liberal feels very disrupted right now, whereas but
even in a time, and pretty much the entirety of the Bible is pretty much written, there's exceptions, but pretty much the majority of the time is the Jewish people or Christian people writing in a time where they were dynamically opposed to whoever the controlling party was at the time.
Oh, absolutely.
And out of that, they still have the rule, and they lived by the rule, which is to live by the law of your land. That there's obviously things like when it was illegal to be a Christian, we didn't stop being Christians. But also it's like we Jesus said, render to Caesar what is Caesar's. Submit to the authority that God's put above you.
Pray for them.
Pray for them. And I think that's the big thing too, is that we shouldn't try and be necessarily the rebellious kind of end day. We're rebels already in a sinful world,
right?
But also we should want to be represented well in the eyes of the community and the governance. So like you said, that hopefully a day comes where they know, hey, we can actually trust them. And I was even talking about this with you were talking about the Anglican priest that was on my show, Reverend David Straw. And one thing we talked about, and I think people so much forget, is if we eliminated every single organization that was here because of the church, what would our cities look like?
Oh, so not good.
What would it look like if every foster care place disappeared? What would it look like if the Isaiah House stopped being here? What would it look like if Borrowed Hearts stopped existing? And then the even bigger ones that people don't even think about, Ascension, Deaconess,
or just people being good parents in their house, man.
Good parents. Like the amount that we even talked about, the first episode I ever did with a guest on the show was my wife talking about Dave Whitmore and Catalyst and how much they pour into schools like Teacouple and places like that.
Everywhere you go, there's in the neighborhood work we do, not everyone, but so many of them are just people living out their faith, following Jesus. It's wild. There's Christians throughout the city. In fact, we could change the nature and narratives of our local church here in Evansville simply by sharing all the good things that followers of Jesus do. Celebrate the wins, not in a way that brings glory to us, but so in the Sermon on the Mount, it says, let your light shine before all men so that they will see the good work, your good works, and give your Father in heaven the glory. We need to do a better job telling the story, not of us as prideful, not of us as of holding up our own churches, as you mentioned earlier, organization or name title, but holding up our kingdom works and letting it shine before all men so that people will glorify God and see his missionary people. Like that is what we need to do. And that's the narrative that needs to change, because you are absolutely right. The good works of people all over our city are not exclusive to followers of Jesus, but they are dominated by people of Jesus. That's for sure.
And to end off, if someone was interested in Community One or the many different groups that y'all are affiliated with, where can they go to find you and to get connected with you?
The easiest way is just go to Community One's website. Simple Google search will do, because there on there you can find my email address or any one of our team members' address. But really, I kind of mourn the For Evansville kind of pause moment that we're in, that would kind of elevated the Church of Evansville, because a lot of people could go there to find all the different amazing things that are going on. But in the meantime, I guarantee, just go talk to your pastor. There's a very good chance that your local pastor knows of Community One, and probably works with us on some level. Or you could reach out to Andy Miles, our mobilization director. Her full-time job is to focus on helping people join in the mission of God in our city, and not necessarily just Community One. So, the easiest way is Community One website.
Perfect. The link will be down in the description. I'm excited to see when Love Your Neighborhood Season 2 finally comes out.
Yeah, we'll tag you on there.
You better. I made it.
Yeah, you did. You're very great. Very easy to work with. Give a shout out to Jonah. Very pleasant guy if you need to produce a podcast.
Y'all were pros. Y'all made it easy. I appreciate you being on, man.
Yeah, thanks, Jonah.